With that being said, enough of me. I can close my mouth now. The king is here. The award-winning Dante King from the Bay Area, man, putting on for the Bay, representing, getting his book all across the country. Folks is tapping in. I apologize to him because I missed the book signing last week as I was dealing with COVID. So I got to catch him at one of his other book signing events to get my book signed. But again, thank you for being here. We're going to bring up Brother Dante King, and he's coming back to bless the both sides of the conversation community. Welcome back, King. How you doing, good brother? You got to unmute yourself, brother. As you see all the things that's taking place on social media, how the increase anti-blackness is happening more and more and more. Let's talk about it, man. Let's jump into it. Talk about your book and let people know what's going on, baby.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Brother John, for having me. Hello to everybody who's out there, who may be watching. One of the things I want to say that I want to share is that I'm going to be, well, let me say this first. I've written this book, The 400-Year Holocaust, White America's Legal, Psychopathic, and Sociopathic Black Genocide and the Revolt Against Critical Race Theory. And so much of what I am going to be sharing with you tonight comes from a course that I teach at both. I've taught it for UCSF. There's a course that I teach, and I think Brother John just posted the link to it. It's called Understanding the Roots of Racism and Bias, Anti-Blackness and Its Links to Whiteness, White Racism, Privilege, and Power. The other is a link to a 12-week course that will be available, and I think it's actually going to be 14 weeks, but it's 12 weeks. And I urge you all that if you have like professional development dollars out there that you get from your organization that you can use towards taking a course like this, it will be more than worth your while. I think the layers and the nuances of anti-Blackness, and when we talk about anti-Blackness, it's very complex. You know, it's not just one thing. One of the things that Dr. Amos Wilson says, and I'm going to get to actually a few quotes by him, is that the Black criminal, if you will, and I will expand this to Black people in general, the way in which Black Americans function, and particularly Black Americans, African American people, not people who come here and who have immigrated over recent years willingly, or their parents came here in the 60s or 70s and they've come here willingly. I'm talking about Black Americans whose parents, grandparents went through Jim Crow, who also endured the period of the antebellum period, which is the period of legal enslavement, that we as a people emulate in every way white people and white culture, because, and I say this in my book as well, because those are the people, and I'll say it another way, we emulate Eurocentric ways of presenting, thinking, our thought patterns. Everything about us is through the framework of domination and being colonized by white people. And so therefore, when we have conversations or discussions about Black people, anything that we see as a flaw, if you will, about Black people is either the result of white oppression entirely, not 90%, or 80% or 60%. It's the result of white oppression entirely. And then the other part of it is we don't know a reality outside of the reality that white people have allowed us to have. And so with that said, we are white people in brown skin, in brown and Black skin. And so when we talk about the Black criminal, Black people using guns or violence that happens, or the trope of Black on Black crime, we're really talking about what white people have introduced to us and facilitated and perpetuated as a culture of being. We were inducted into a culture of violence, and we were brought here under violent circumstances. And when we got here, the conditions that were regulated upon our community, both upon us as Black people, both individually and collectively, were violent circumstances. And so you have Black rage or Black anger as the result of white terrorism, okay? And so I'm gonna go to a file. I'm gonna share some slides with you. 1 second. I will share my screen. So anti-Blackness, I'll just define this before I go into a few frames or framing about the point that I just made. So anti-Blackness is a white American legal, social, cultural, economic, institutional value and belief system. It involves the deprioritization of humans labeled as Black people, as well as the criminalization, hyper-negativity, hyper-scrutiny, and negative positioning of Black people and or anything perceived as Blackness throughout all aspects of American life. And so to go back to the point that I was making just a second ago in regards to our framing, our ways of coming to life and understanding what life is, how we think about life, how we think about our experiences as Black people in this culture, is because we have been dominated. It's total domination. So Dr. Amos Wilson says we have a school system that is based upon the psychology of white children and white people. If we are trying to educate our children in that system, they are bound to fail. The very structure of the educational system itself is based upon a white model, and therefore it has a built-in failure mechanism for us, one way or the other. European historiography functions to maintain a social system, to psychologize and create a personality orientation in its readers or hearer. Through force, deceit, and mental manipulation, European historiography creates normative beliefs and pathologies that conditions the mind and behaviors of the oppressed. Joe Fagan, in his book, The White Racial Frame, stated that the dominant white created racial frame provides an overarching and generally destructive worldview, extending across white divisions of class, gender, and age. Since its early development in the 17th century, this powerful frame has provided the vantage point from which white Americans have constantly viewed North American society. Its centrality, so the white racial frame's centrality in white minds, is what makes it a dominant frame throughout the country and indeed in much of the Western world and in numerous other areas. Over time, this powerful frame, and I need you to hear me on this, has been elaborated by or imposed on the minds of most Americans, becoming thereby the country's dominant frame of mind and frame of reference in regard to racial matters and all other matters. So the way in which we are expected to speak, what we regard as knowledge or information or valuable knowledge or valuable information through a white educational academic framework, that is what has been established in this country as the be-all, end-all. And so if you don't fit into that model, if you don't think the way in which white people require you to think and or present, it will limit your ability to survive, right? And so there's an emphasis on white academia in this country. You must be college educated. You must have be able to prove that you have this type of experience and you have this, you are able to exhibit and or meet the standards of certain ways of computing and or analyzing and or presenting information. If you don't meet white standards through a white regulated academic institutional environment or landscape, then you are essentially, by Americanized standards, white America's standards, not qualified. You are deemed, in some cases, incompetent, incapable. So, like, we really need to think hard about, like, where we get our ways of coming to information or our ways of thinking, our thought patterns, our ways of being. So, one of the things I want to focus on tonight, and so I'm going to share some additional perspectives from some other social scientists, and people have talked about this, because Black Americans are the only people who have been entirely colonized and dominated by white people. Everything that we do, every way that we come to life is modeled upon that. So in this whole landscape, there is the reality of internalized oppression, right? And so internalized oppression leads to navigating my ethnic identity and or being the other in this space, and everything about what I do is I'm trying to fit in. I'm trying to be deemed socially, intellectually acceptable through the landscape of white America. And so there are ways in which this impacts and affects our self-esteem as Black people, feeling inferior, not feeling like we are good enough, being told very early on that we have to work 10 to 15 times harder. And that is a reality. We absolutely do. To be deemed on par or as capable enough with non-Black counterparts, and particularly white counterparts, who are insufficient, deficient, and or mediocre in most cases, right? What we have to do in a room, what we have to do to be in the room. It affects and impacts our collective self-esteem, because one of the ways that this deeply traumatizes and works against Black families is with Black parents who have not investigated the very things that I'm saying, and then for example, using the white educational system to determine whether or not let me put it this way, to determine their child's value and self-worth. And I saw this growing up with my cousins. I experienced it with my mother, unfortunately, to say this. I mean, she didn't know any better, but when you don't perform well in school, then that equals or can equal to a degree this perception that something is wrong with the child. And we bought into a white system of diagnosing our children based on behavioral standards that white people have deemed as the standard, culturally acceptable ways of being in class and or behaving. And so therefore you got ADD, ADHD, all of these things. And so our children are being pumped with medicine because we have people who have for centuries committed legalized and regulated terror, systematic terror onto us. And because we don't necessarily, or we haven't assessed on our own terms and through our own thinking, ways of thinking, the situation at hand and what is happening, many of us just go with it. And that's not to call anyone out. That's not my purpose at all. It's just to point out the ways in which the racialized trauma and the damage continues to persist in the ways that it happens. I remember some people that I knew, even my cousins, being disciplined or put on punishment when they didn't do well in school. And it was never, okay, so what's happening with the teacher? Is the teacher ineffective, or are they not good, if you will, or they not effective at the ways in which they come to the profession? Why are they not engaging my child? Do they have a bias? Are they treating other children in ways that are making them want to learn, that are making them engage with what's happening in ways that are not happening or convincing or compelling other students to learn, because maybe favoritism is being shown, right? Instead, it's like, okay, you got bad grades, you're put on punishment, you got bad grades, you're getting a whooping, and so on and so forth. And so that leads to depression. It leads to our children disengaging, right? They'll drop out of school. And it's nothing wrong with them. They're just not engaged, and they're not engaged with the subject matter, because the subject matters in school it's a white framework. So science, math are important because they feed into certain industries, economic industries for white people, that for example, technology, architecture, which we definitely need in our environment. And yet, if people don't fit into those particular categories, if they don't do well, then they're deemed less valuable in a sense, right? The way that we value capitalism and money in this culture, that's another example. And so if you don't have a lot of money, and again, this is a white capitalistic system, a white way of thinking also, then you're deemed inadequate, or you're deemed unsuccessful or not as successful. All of these things we've learned by being in this culture. And so I'm going to stop here and actually play a video. I'm going to share a video because, wait 1 second. There are a few people that discuss this, but I'm going to share one particular video that, you know what? I'm going to share my system.
Why you pulling that up, Dante? What about peanut butter? Because I used to tell peanut butter is what gave my ADHD and my ADD and my OCD and all of that. Is it the peanut butter? I need to know, is it the peanut butter and jelly as well?
I don't think the peanut butter did it. I don't think the peanut butter is what was doing it. Hold on. Give me 1 second.
All right, go ahead and pull it up.
All right, I got it. I need to share my whole screen. So just give me 1 second. I'm gonna go to this.
No problem.
Okay.
All right, here it goes up.
All right.
I'd like to say one thing on that. I think the question you asked is how do the schools accomplish this? I mean, you were concerned about the process. I think we got to understand that there's no such thing as objective truth, which is implicit in everything that Clark says. That white people use the institutions to accomplish white purpose. The white purpose is to maintain a power position and keep everybody else in a subordinate, powerless kind of position. Now that's the institution's purpose. And that's the way it functions, how it functions. And we got to realize then that everything that the schools teach is designed to fit into that purpose. The schools teach not objective truth, but what the white man wants to project as truth. Now that's from the very kindergarten right straight on through.
For example, what?
Sociology. Sociology is not a science in the sense that it's dealing objectively with the way people live together. It's dealing with the white man's pattern of living together as the norm by which we judge how other people live. If you live like white people live, then you're living the way you are supposed to live. If not, you're either primitive or insane as a people. Psychologically, it's the same thing. Psychology does not deal with any objective kind of discussion or development of how people live or analysis of how people function as individuals, but how does the white man function? If the white man does it this way, then this is the norm by which we judge all other people. If the white man is violent, then actually all people have to be violent to be normal. If you're not violent, obviously there's something wrong with you. You should be in an insane asylum. The whole pattern that's set up as a norm for human behavior by psychologists, the whole library full of it. psychiatrists, everybody that's dealing with it is dealing with it from a white point of view. So they teach white children, black children and white children, to look through white eyes. From the kindergarten on, the black child is beginning to look at the world and interpret it through white eyes. Everything he is wrong. Everything that exists in his community is wrong. We ought to declare that white music really is no.
So, Brother John, what were your thoughts about that?
Man, I mean, that's deep. Because, I know that's a older video, but I think that's where we at today, Dante. Unfortunately, we feel like we have to compete at the white folk standard. If we try to do things different ways, it's the corporate way, the white model. I experienced it today, man. I had to tell somebody in a professional environment, like, I'm just speaking, and the person told me, a white person told me that I was speaking loud or hostile. And I said, listen, man, you don't get to police my tone. You know what I'm saying? I'm not doing nothing. I'm just trying to explain to you something that you're doing that's you can't do. It's not like I'm not being aggressive with you. It's just, but then you don't got the right to police my tone. So I think
they believe they do.
Yeah. So that right there was like, I just experienced it today. So we are still caught in this, right? And then the other thing I like,
and we police each other based on these white standards.
But that's what I'm saying. So the influence of this white model has impacted our community so much. Like you said, now we embrace it and we do it to each other. Or we play the submissive games, or we play the victimization game, like how those Karens, they do stuff, and then when somebody, rebuttal or hold them accountable, then they're the victims. Oh, why are you doing this to me? Why are you know what I mean? And I see it amongst black folks too, man. And that's something we really got to stop in our community. But it happens a lot. But again, that's the foundation of where we're picking up this behavior from.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that E. Franklin Frazier says in his book, The Black Bourgeoisie, which was written in 1957, he talks about how he observes during that time period and before, really since the period of emancipation and people becoming free, and our whole schema, our whole landscape or set of ideals that we have around Black excellence, which W.E.B. Du Bois referred to as, having a progress mentality. All of that is built around white standards in white ways of survival in white America, in a white American cultural institutional system in landscape. And so Frazier discusses this in many ways, but in one of the ways he talks about is the insecurity of Black people, of being just proud of who we are. And he's looking out into larger society during this period, and he's saying the goal of Black people at this point, our standards for progress, is to move as far away from what it means to be Black and or traditionally Black, or how that's seen. And it's also to be like white people. So he says, second, let me just get this up. He says, since the Black bourgeoisie, and he's talking about middle-class Black people, affluent class Black people. He says, since the Black bourgeoisie live largely in a world of make-believe, the masks which they wear to play their sorry roles conceal the feelings of inferiority and the insecurity and the frustrations that haunt their inner lives. So what he's saying here is that we can look at Black celebrities, we can look at people that we deem as having established a certain degree of success or prominence. Oh, we got a Black mayor, we got a Black board of supervisors, we got a Black president. Oh, look at Jay-Z and Beyonce, right? When we look at these people and we look at the clothes that they wear, this is just one example. They are wearing clothes made by European designers. They are required to present in ways that white people find acceptable, or they will not sustain and or be in their positions. In Black people getting fame per se or having success is typically through exploitation. Our presence here in this society has always been through exploitation. So for example, we provide value to sports, if you will, entertainment, in terms of white capitalism, or being a white capitalistic institution that provides high benefits, high pay, if you will, or for the people who participate in it. And we're watching, for the most part, Black and brown people who are on teams, who are running across courts, they're shooting balls into a basket, or they're running across the court and they're being tackled as they try to rush a ball from one end of a field to another. And that's not to say that there's anything right or wrong with this. I want to invite all of you to think outside of the framework of right or wrong. What I'm saying is that that's exploitation. We're watching these people literally, in most cases, get hurt in terms of football, and or we're watching them provide entertainment, and they're being compensated substantially by their team owners who are predominantly white. In approximately 95 to 98% of the cases, the owners of these teams are white. And again, not to say that there's anything wrong with it, but that's how exploitation happens. Over-sexualizing or over-sexualization of the Black female, which has been a cultural affect or a cultural component of America since the early days of white colonialism, over-exploiting Black females. So we will provide them with high degrees of compensation if they present themselves in ways that, how can I say that? I want to choose my words carefully. If they provide entertainment in ways that promote sex, and or, there's a caveat, they must fit the white aesthetic. They must be lighter presenting. They must, in most cases, have long, straight hair, weave. And if it's blonde, that's a plus. And so if anyone out there is, someone just sent me a message and said, you're talking about Beyonce. I'm not talking about Beyonce. I'm just talking about the aesthetic. So anyway, he goes on to say, despite their attempt to escape from real identification with the masses of Negroes, they cannot escape the mark of oppression any more than their less favored kinsmen. In attempting to escape identification with the Black masses, they have developed a self-hatred that reveals itself in their deprecation of the physical and social characteristics of Negroes. Likewise, their feelings of inferiority and insecurity are revealed in their pathological struggle for status within the isolated Negro world and craving for recognition in the white world. Their escape into a world of make-believe with its sham society leaves them with a feeling of emptiness and futility, which causes them to constantly seek an escape in new delusions. Dr. Jerome Fox, who wrote the workbook Addicted to White, he says, we as a people worldwide are addicted to a white value system that's predicated on narcissism, greed, and violence. And I zoom in on that to identify 5 white values that we are principally addicted to. Value number 1, that everything Black is bad and inferior, and everything white is good and superior. Value number 2, we put things, money, and the things that money buys above relationships. Value number 3, oppressors are trustworthy recorders and interpreters of history and reality. That's why we listen to their news, so-called mainstream news, and read their history books without questioning everything that we hear in everything that we read. White value number 4, individualism is better than collectivism. Hence, obligations to the group are subordinate to personal gain. So it's all about me, which is why many Black people of today can't understand or figure out why when we get Black leaders in high positions of power, they're not really concerned about the Black masses. Like, let's say things were 100 years ago or 120 years ago, because our quest to become more like white people have put us more in alignment with their ways of existing, thinking, being. And so I can be a Black president, I can be a Black governor, I can be a Black mayor, and be doing things that are counter to Black people, because I'm more concerned about keeping my level of notoriety, my level of success, if you will, in being accepted in this environment than I am about the oppression of the community that I come from. And I think one flaw that we have as a community currently as Black people is we don't want to call out Black leaders who are counter to the progress of the collective community. And that's a flaw. That is a flaw, because in many cases, they can be more harmful to us as Black people than other non-Black people who are more psychosocially, psychospiritually, and aware of the state of Black America and the things that need to be done to address the issues that currently exist that are in terms of the oppressive forces that we face. He says, white value number 5, the best way to feel good about yourself is by surpassing, outdoing, and defeating someone else in an activity, achievement, or personal characteristic. This value, in summary, is competition over cooperation. And clearly, there are things that we as a people need to do in order to secure our freedom and liberation, but that require our unity. The only way to accomplish that is through us being unified. And obviously, if you're constantly looking for ways to distinguish yourself from your fellow Black brother and sister, there will be no cooperation. So, Brother John, I would like to hear your thoughts about what I just shared.
I don't know if you want to hear my thoughts, Dante, because they're going to be pissed off. You see how the first thing they do is come at you and say, you talking about Beyonce, right? I'm glad you point that out, because listen, it ain't about Beyonce. We talk about the influence. When you look on social media, okay, you look in our communities, you look in San Francisco. I'm just going to speak here. I know we got people watching all over the place, but here in the Bay Area, you look around our communities, you see our Black women putting blonde hair in, going to get, all of this body work done, right? And it's like, sometimes I sit back and that's why I'm always empowered, to hear the conversation for you, because Black women was demonized, back in the days for having big lips and big hips. And now, because a lot of white folks is doing it, and it's coming to be this trend again.
But we literally, that's not on the backs of Black women, or that's of no fault of their own. That is what has been deemed valuable in this society. And so for one's survival, making themselves more valuable becomes necessary for your survival. Just like Black men, who in many cases, such as myself, once upon a time, did the bidding of white people. I tell people all the time, I was groomed by white people. I did their bidding. I believed in inclusion and equity. I mean, just living in a fantasy world about trying to have inclusion with people who grow up in a society and a reality where they are reinforced that they are superior. They're not trying to be equal to you or have inclusion. Inclusion, inequality, and equity, that is only the pursuit of the oppressed. It is not the pursuit of the oppressor. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. So why is inclusion, diversity the biggest business in America, in corporate America right now?
Right. Because
it's terrible.
It's a tool of oppression, and it's symbolism. No real change is happening. It's symbolic.
And it's terrible, Dante, because it goes back to what I said the last time we spoke about George Floyd, the police brutality bill that didn't get passed, okay? And then you had Nancy Pelosi and all of the Congress folks up there dressed in dashikis and African solidarity, and nothing never happened.
So I want to be clear before I move into this next portion of what I'm presenting here. I started off with defining anti-Blackness, right? And I want to be very clear based on the examples and the perspectives that I just shared from some of these other authors and literary people who have done this work, who have been in this space for a while. White people created anti-Blackness, and they have been successful in programming an entire culture in society to be anti-Black. What does that mean? That means we focus on Black people. That means that as much as white people have designed it, and it sits with them severely and mostly, it also cuts across all communities. The Asian community, and I have some references to this in my book, acclimate and ascribe to anti-Black philosophy and principles and an anti-Black value system. Hispanics, Latinx folks, for the most part, ascribe to an anti-Black philosophy, value, and belief system. Black people in America ascribe to an anti-Black philosophy, value, and belief system. And so we can all be implicated. And so I want to create that landscape because it is important for where I'm going. Now, this next portion of my presentation will focus on some of the things that the ways in which the Supreme Court of the United States weaponized their power against the Black community between roughly 1870, well, I'll say the end of slavery. Let's start with 1865 to 1900. So I'm going to cover that period. And I want you to keep in mind what I said about Black people emulating the behaviors of white people and our response and reaction mechanisms being predicated upon white terrorism and white violence that has been enacted against us through the American federal government, as well as the masses of white constituents that vote and that rally for certain statutes, laws, and rulings that further oppress Black people. What were you going to say?
Dante, I just want to say before you do your next slide, can you name some of that programming? Because I think that's important for our community to know, like name some of that program of, how they highlight to deem Black folk, you know what I'm saying? Like the new, like, you know what I mean? Some of that stuff that you put in there about the media and stuff.
Well, our internal reactions for who we deem as sophisticated, who we deem as smart, who we deem as, I get people all the time to tell me, you are so smart. You are so educated. The reason, I'm very clear about the reasons that they tell me that. They tell me that because to a certain degree, I have a certain command on the English language so that when I present and I use certain words, it is in alignment with the white American cultural linguistic system. So in essence, they're saying, wow, you sound like what I have been taught to deem intellectual, smart, the way that you dress, you look so nice, right? Yeah, I wear my nice little European suits and you look so nice, Dante. Yep, that's because I am emulating what is socially acceptable standards of Eurocentricity. Now, compare that to, I don't know.
Compare it to me. I got my hat on. I talk like I'm from the hood.
Yes, you don't fit the ideal of what we amplify or label as intellectual, as sophisticated? No. And what that does for you is it allows people, in many cases, not all, not me, but in many cases, to devalue what you're saying, how and what you have to say in any moment. It's the same with women. I see it all the time with Black women. The fact that there is a disrespect, that we don't value Black femininity, that we mistreat Black femininity, but we worship white femininity. We've been trained to respect, trained to idealize, trained to respond nicely and compassionately to white women and Black men. Black men have been trained this way, and everyone in our society have been trained this way. And like you said, then you can have people who are committing violence against Black children, like the white woman who said that the boy touched her butt and he was just walking past her and it was his backpack and they had to pull footage from the store camera, and she insisted that he touched her butt and that she wanted him arrested. A 12-year-old? I mean, something is really, really, really wrong. And we haven't investigated it as such. So I'm going to refer to some slides. So this is, again, focusing on this period between the 1866 and through 1900. And just go pull these up. So in 1866, you've got the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that was co-sponsored by Lyman Trumbull. And this act basically said that any citizen has the right has the same rights as a white citizen, or has the same right as a white citizen to make and enforce contracts, sue and be sued, give evidence in court, and inherit, purchase, sell, hold, and convey real and personal property. The act all guaranteed to all citizens the full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of person and property as is enjoyed by white citizens. Okay, so it declared all persons born in the United States to be citizens. So this is the act that made Black people citizens, if you will, without distinction of race or color or previous condition of slavery or involuntary servitude. It also says, so I just talked about this, then in 1868, you got the 14th Amendment, which stated no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Okay? So you have this case in 1873, this situation. It's the Butchers Benevolent Association versus Crescent City. This is in Louisiana. So Louisiana passed a law that restricted slaughterhouse operations in New Orleans to a single corporation. Pursuant to the law, the Crescent City Livestock Landing and Slaughterhouse Company received a charter to run a slaughterhouse downstream from the city. No other areas around the city were permitted for slaughtering animals over the next 25 years, and existing slaughterhouses would be closed. Now, there was a reason for this because there was a rampant outbreak of bacteria. So there were reasons why they came to this decision to a certain extent, to a certain degree. They could have permitted at least one or two others, right? But they didn't. So a group of butchers argued that they would lose their right to practice their trade and earn a livelihood under the monopoly. Specifically, they argued the monopoly created involuntary servitude in violation of the 13th Amendment. So these are Black butchers, and abridged privileges or immunities, denied equal protection of the laws, and deprived them of liberty and property without due process of law in violation of the 14th Amendment. Okay? The Supreme Court held that the monopoly violated neither the 13th or 14th Amendment, reasoning that these amendments were passed with the narrow intent to grant full equality to former slaves. Thus, to the court, the 14th Amendment only banned the states from depriving Blacks of equal rights. It did not guarantee that all citizens, regardless of race, should receive equal economic privileges by the state. So it reinterpreted the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court reinterpreted the 14th Amendment and applied a narrow application of what the 14th Amendment was intended to do, indeed countering what it was really intended to do. So Dr. Amos Wilson, again, he says, I keep trying to warn Black people, your security does not reside in civil rights laws. A law is merely writing on the books, and writing does not protect people. The law is only as strong as those who enforce it. And you've got the law written by your enemy and enforced by your enemy, which means that when the enemy decides to stop enforcing it, it's over for you. Or the enemy can decide to rewrite it. So in May 1870, Congress passed the Enforcement Act, which prohibited groups of people from banding together to go in disguise upon the public highways or upon the premises of another. So why do you think this act was necessary, Brother John?
It was definitely needed to protect white folks.
Well, it was meant to protect Black people. It was meant because Black
we're
people,
not protected though, Dante. We still not protected with the 14th Amendment.
Well, no. So this is May 1870, right? So Congress passed this Enforcement Act to stop groups that were going in disguise upon highways or the premises of others to violate their constitutional rights, because Black people were trying to exercise their constitutional rights by the 14th Amendment, right? And I think the 15th Amendment may have been passed by this time, or it came later, a little bit after this. But so they're actually, no, I think it was passed by this time. Anyway, so they are trying to protect Black people from groups like the Red Shirts by the KKK. There's rampant white extremist violence that's occurring during this period. And so Black people are unprotected, essentially, in the South. They are left to people who lost the war, that wanted to maintain slavery, and now these same people have the power to legislate against them and or to intimidate them, so Black people cannot exercise their constitutional rights. So you have that law, then you have the Ku Klux Klan Act, which is a law that went further, which is another enforcement act that's called the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, where President Ulysses was authorized to use federal troops and emergency measures to overthrow the KKK in the South, okay? So, you've got the Colfax Massacre. This is 1873. In this case that occurs where whites attack Blacks because Black people are trying to enact their constitutional right to vote. And they are also meeting in a facility in town, which is like a community facility, to meet about how they're going to vote and go to the polls, and also who they are going to put forth as a candidate to run in this particular election. So they are surrounded by a group of whites who shoot into the facility and massacre them. Okay, so there were about 100 to 150 Black people who were massacred inside of this facility. So these are illustrations of the wounded, the people who were dead, who were murdered, and who were being dragged away by people during that period. This appeared in Harper's Weekly right after the Colfax Massacre. So it's one of the worst instances of racial violence during Reconstruction, in which more than 100 Blacks were killed. Chief Justice Morrison R. Waite argued that the right to peaceable assembly was a natural right that preceded the adoption of the Constitution, rather than a right guaranteed by it. For Waite, the First Amendment prohibited Congress from abridging the right to assemble, but was not intended to limit the powers of the state governments in respect to their own citizens. but to operate on the national government alone. Chief Justice Morrison Waite, okay? So the Supreme Court found that while Congress has the right to protect individuals meeting for purposes of petitioning the national government, the indictments had made no claim that the individuals arrested and charged were attempting to deny this right to anyone, or that the actions in this case were specifically directed at individuals on the basis of race. So the Supreme Court of the United States, this group of 9 white men at the time, decided that the 14th Amendment was not designed to protect individuals against the actions of other individuals, but only from those of the state itself. The court overturned the convictions of whites who were charged with conspiring to deprive those Blacks of their constitutional rights, including to vote. So they essentially, with this ruling, made it legal for whites to terrorize Black people, okay? Because Black people can no longer, their constitutional rights and their physical rights as a community based on this ruling are no longer protected. So you've got John Langston Mercer, who's an attorney, educator, civil rights activist. He's also the founder of Howard Law School, pictured here on the right. You've got Charles Sumner, who's noted as an abolitionist and a civil rights activist, noted on the left. They sponsored the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which was a United States federal law that was enacted during the Reconstruction era in response to civil rights violations to African Americans. So this act essentially was enacted to protect all citizens in their civil and legal rights, giving them equal treatment and public accommodations, public transportation, and to prohibit exclusion from jury service, right? So the bill was passed by the 43rd U.S. Congress and signed into law by President Grant on March 1st, 1875. On March 23rd, 1875, the Tennessee legislature approved House Bill 527, which permitted hotels, inns, public transportation, and amusement parks to refuse admission and service to any person for any reason. 3 weeks before, federal authorities had enacted the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which guaranteed African Americans equal treatment in public accommodations and jury service, okay? So by enacting a state law that allowed for all kinds of discrimination, including on the basis of race, Tennessee officials had defiantly authorized the very discrimination the federal law prohibited. So if the federal law says one thing and now state law is saying another, it's totally contradictory. What do you do as a Black person that's trying to enact, that's being discriminated against because you can't go into certain businesses? And this happened in places like San Francisco, New York. It's not only just happening in Tennessee, right? So all of these people, couples, families that are experiencing this type of treatment, they sue these companies. And the states essentially uphold that discrimination on the basis of race is allowable. It's just fine. So these cases, a number of cases, make their way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so there were 5 legal cases: United States v. Stanley, United States v. Ryan, United States v. Nichols, United States v. Singleton, and Robinson and Weiss in Memphis and Charleston Railroad, that the U.S. Supreme Court consolidated into a single ruling on October 15, 1883, in which the court declared that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional, okay? So the cases against Stanley and Nichols were indictments for denying Black people the accommodations of an inn or hotel. Ryan was charged with refusing a Black person a seat at McGuire's Theater in San Francisco, and Singleton denied a person whose color was not given to the use of accommodations at the Grand Opera House in New York. The case of Robinson and Weiss against the Memphis and Charleston Railroad Company was an action to recover $500 given by the second section of the 1875 Act. The grievance was the refusal by the railroad conductor to allow the wife to ride in the ladies' car because of her African descent. In his majority opinion in the civil rights cases, Associate Justice Joseph P. Bradley, on the right, struck down the Civil Rights Act of 1875, holding that the 13th Amendment merely abolishes slavery and that the 14th Amendment did not give Congress the power to outlaw private acts of racial discrimination. Okay? So again, Dr. Amos Wilson says, I keep trying to warn Black people, your security does not reside in civil rights laws. A law is merely writing on the books, and writing does not protect people. The law is only as strong as those who enforce it. And you've got the law written by your enemy and enforced by your enemy, which means that when the enemy decides to stop enforcing it, it's over for you. So they essentially ruled that racial discrimination was permissible, that Congress did not have the right to not permit it. And I want you to think about this in relationship to what happens roughly 81 years later. You've got a Congress of predominantly white people who at the time feel that limiting discrimination on the basis of race or prohibiting it is the right thing to do. So the law is flexible, and it is according to whatever purpose or objective white people want to accomplish at any given time that they want to accomplish it. And so having people of color, having a Black president, having Black state representatives, Black senators, or again, representatives who are concerned about their own self-progress and well-being in a racist society does not provide that the rights of Black and brown people will be advocated for. And you got white people who are deciding what is best for white people. So even those people who are white, liberal, progressive Democrats, guess what? They benefit from the white supremacy, whether they want to own it or acknowledge or not. They call it white privilege, but they benefit. Everything that white Republicans, and I'm talking QAnon folks, Tea Party folks, moderate right-wing folks, everything that they do to enact agendas and conditions and circumstances that they benefit from, the most white liberal progressive people benefit from. So it is not a win or lose situation. It is a win-win situation. Okay? So the Supreme Court, and this is another decision, Pace v. Alabama, January 29, 1883. In November 1881, a jury in Clark County, Alabama, convicted Tony Pace, a Black man, and Mary Cox, a white woman, under Section 4189 of the Alabama Code, which criminalized fornication and adultery between persons of different races and outlawed interracial marriage. Mr. Pace and Ms. Cox were sentenced to 2 years in prison. On January 29, 1883, in Pace v. Alabama, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously upheld their convictions, reasoning that the anti-miscegenation statute, which means laws prohibiting white people from marrying Black people and laws prohibiting white people from marrying any other person except for a white person, did not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment because the penalty applied equally to each member of the interracial couple. So I want you to look at the reasoning here. Pace failed, so this Supreme Court decision failed to overturn the reasoning of the Alabama Supreme Court. I'm sorry, not the decision, but Pace failed to overturn the reasoning of the Alabama Supreme Court, which had held that fornication between persons of different races was exceptionally evil because it could result in the amalgamation of the two races, producing a mongrel population and a degraded civilization, the prevention of which is dictated by a sound public policy affecting the highest interests of society and government. Again, this is the Supreme Court that are not only taking away the rights of Black people, But with each one of these rulings, they are serving to dehumanize Black people. The rulings and the objectives and the motivations behind the rulings are rooted in an anti-Black psychology, an anti-Black sociopathy. You have people who are regarded as intelligent, as prominent, as highly intellectual, intellectually sound, who are really sociopaths when it comes to Black people, but who are in positions of power to make such rulings and such judgments. So in United States v. Harris, which is another decision in 1883, that decided that indictments against a Tennessee sheriff and his accomplices who were accused of attacking 4 Black men and killing one, that the Force Act of 1871 that I referred to a moment ago, the KKK Act, that was passed to protect Black Americans from violent terrorism, well, they deemed it unconstitutional because they said that the 14th Amendment limited Congress to taking remedial steps against state action that violated the 14th Amendment and applied only to acts by states and not to acts of individuals. So because they ruled that the Force Act was indeed unconstitutional, they facilitated rampant violent terrorism against Black people. They opened the door, essentially, for Black people to be terrorized and for white people to perpetrate the most vile deeds onto the Black community, onto Black Americans in every state in this country. And I think it is important to understand this grounding and this landscape of laws, if you will. Essentially, these are court rulings, so it's federal law at this point, in order to understand what happens next. So, Brother John, I'm going to just ask you what your reactions are to what I just shared.
Man, my reaction is, Dante, we in trouble because everything you showed me is what we're going through right now today.
Bingo.
I mean, you got Roe vs. Wade.
Bingo.
How they trying to redo that, right? So it's almost like we're going back in time right now.
It's not that we're going back. It's that we have been mentally or psychologically convinced and told a story and preached a story of progress over the last 150 years that has not happened. And so the progress viewpoint of oppressed people is rooted in oppression, in domination. You will accept incremental progress because anything better, anything that seems or that is pitched to you that seems better or different based on what circumstances were previously, or it's been made to look different, it gives some sense of relief. But we never focus on progress when it comes to oppressors, when it comes to people who are benefiting from our oppression, because they don't accept incremental progress. They have an entitlement position or positionality. They have an entitlement mentality. I want what I want now. You're going to tell me I can't come out the house, that I have to wear a mask? I will take guns to the Capitol and show you that I'm not. I will threaten the governor of my state. I'll get a group of people together and threaten to kidnap and murder the governor of the state and not have any charges brought against me, is what those white men did. And I believe it was Michigan.
Yeah. No, it was
right.
Michigan. Yeah, no. So
right.
I mean, to me though, you said something powerful. We made the statement. It's a win-win for them because I look at the political alignment that we have now. And folks want to say the right, and I'm glad you said that about the progressives in the left because they are in a win-win right now, and we're in the middle. So it doesn't matter who you put in office; they scratching each other back. So that's what I'm saying.
Bingo.
So when do we as community step out of the realm of the alignment?
So in all of the framing that I'm giving tonight, most Black people don't process through this framing. They process through the framing of an idea of hope or through the mindset and psychology of white supremacy. So therefore, as Dr. Wilson pointed out, we watch their news, we send our children to their educational institutions to frame, and that's what Albert Clegg was saying as well on that clip from the show, A Black Paper on White Racism. He was saying that we teach our children, we psychologize our children to look through white eyes, to think like white people, to believe like white people. So as long as we believe in the idea that things are changing, that there is the potential for hope and on progress on behalf of Black people, the longer we can feel or believe that change is happening in the face of terrorism, in the face of no change, in the face of inflation, an inflation model that is based on what white people can afford at any given moment. That's what drives inflation. What is the average median income? What is the average median assets of middle-class white people? And that is what drives prices up, right? So when you look at how much money white people made on COVID, and particularly when there are several ways, but I'll point out three actually, several ways that this happened. One being that at the onset of COVID, there's all this panic. We have a world situation. Institutions are shutting down. They're not doing business. So what does this mean, right? So stock prices drop. White people are never going to let the system of white capitalism fail. So those with disposable income, guess what they do? They go and they drop their money. I dropped some money into Macy's. I dropped it into United Airlines. I dropped it into Wells Fargo. I did. But these companies, they go and drop their money into Microsoft Teams. They go and drop their money in Zoom. They go and drop their money into AMC. They were selling stock at like $1.25 per share, right? So you drop $50,000 into AMC. You got 50,000 shares. Now AMC goes up to $30 a share, or let's say $20 a share, right? You just made an exponential amount of money. So people are making money at the beginning of COVID. They're also making money off of medical institutions by investing their money into medical institutions, medical equipment, and vaccine companies that sponsor the vaccine. They go and they invest their money because they know that these companies are going to make a ton of money. You also have the federal government that goes and plays a trick, right? So the masses of people in America, they get a $600 check or $400 stimulus check, but 80% of the money that's written into that CARES Act went to corporations under the guise of payment protection. And for people who accepted paycheck protection program loans, PPP, they didn't have to provide any documentation about how they used that money. They just had to put forth a reason. So you got people like Gavin Newsom. I think it was reported that he got $1.2 million for the restaurant that he owns in San Francisco. I think $1.2 million. I think Trump got in the double-digit millions. This is all money that didn't need to be paid back. But you have people with an oppressed mentality who are grateful that they received a $1,600 check. They're grateful that they received a $1,400 check because it's desperate. It's a desperate reality. It's desperation. And I am not saying this, and I don't want anyone to mistake what I'm saying, to pathologize or to further drive home, this mentality that, that Black people are this way. I am stating my observations of some of the responses and reactions I got and just what the results are of white oppression are, and also what the results of white supremacy are. That these people could use the money for anything that they wanted. They didn't have to pay their employees. They could have used it to pay their mortgage up on their building for 2 years. And that was fine with the government because you didn't have to report on anything. So the last pieces that I shared in terms of the rulings that the Supreme Court made during that period, now we're going to look at what began to happen over the next 125 years until today.
Swing on, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing on.
But a black man or woman standing up for equal justice in 1892 was taking a serious risk. On the night of March 9th, when Wells was out of town, her friend Tom Moss and 2 others were jailed for defending themselves against several white men who had attacked Moss's grocery store. Masked vigilantes dragged Moss and his 2 friends from their cells to a deserted railroad yard. Before he died, Moss cried out, "Tell my people to flee. There is no justice here." This lynching, a term that came to be applied to any mob killing of blacks, disheartened Wells.
When she had come back to Memphis, she saw that the community was absolutely devastated, and so was she. No one knew quite what to do. But when she read those words, she said, this is going to be her mission as well. And she begins to tell Black Memphians, there is no justice for you here. The system is not working for us. No one is trying to get these killers of our young men. And it is one we should go.
And go they did. At least 6,000 Black Memphis residents would heed Wells' call to leave. It was the beginning of an exodus that in the coming decades would number in the millions. The murder of her friend also opened her eyes to who the true targets of the lynch mob were.
When her 3 friends were lynched, she began to realize that even Black people, middle-class Black people, could be victims of that. And she talks about how until that happened, she had believed that those excesses, what she called excesses against the race, were only directed against those people who had perhaps done something to deserve it.
This opened my eyes to what lynching really was. An excuse to get rid of Negroes who were acquiring wealth and property, and thus keep the race terrorized and keep the niggers down.
Ida Wells is one voice that says that that these assumptions of Black people, that we can actually come to some negotiated settlement with whites in this period, is a false assumption, and that you have to fight. That the only way we're going to do it is to fight.
Ida B. Wells would eventually leave Memphis for Chicago. There she began her crusade against the murder of Southern Blacks, which she would continue for the rest of her life. But across the South, lynching continued. Edward White, Vance McClure, Link Wagner, Robert Williams, George King, Scott Sherman, John Fry, Ovid Belzer, William Smith, Falcon Francis, A.L. Smart, Mr. and Mrs. Morris, Patrick Morris, Gilbert Francis, Bird Love, Isaac Pizer, Louis Senegal, Joseph Dizell, Frank James, Louis Munn, Hiram Whiteman, Pisano Usano, Angelo Mongoso.
The tragedy today, I think, is a lot of people think they just hung somebody, but a ritualized lynching was a part of the culture of the South with even religious and patriotic connotations. Think about this. Some white folk, if they had the time, dressed up in their old army garb, their old army uniform, to come out to a lynching. Racism reached a point, it was so dramatized, and so ritualized and codified in the laws and in the practices that it was the most normal, patriotic, the most religious thing that you could do is to worship segregation.
Brother John.
Man, horrific.
Yeah. So, similar, so Ida B. Wells encouraged people to leave. So you have a lot of people during that time that leave and go to Tennessee. They leave and go, I'm sorry, not Tennessee, they leave and go to Chicago, Illinois. Some end up in Indiana. Some go to New York. Some go to California. And so people are trying to escape violent terror, a situation of legalized terror, because the Supreme Court has enacted essentially legalized terror onto Black people. And so she investigates it and she says, just like was recited in the documentary, that, wow, this is not just only happening to I'm gonna frame it a different way. This is not only happening to the drug addicts or the drug dealers or the home invasion robbers. This is happening to us middle class Black people, us who are doing the right thing. We've gone to school, we've got the education, we own our own homes, we own our businesses. Wow, it's happening to us too, right? It's a realization. And we are having the same reckoning 139 years later. Okay? So that was from The Rise and Fall of Jim Crow. I think the first segment. So this is L.D. Nelson on the left, and his mother, Lauren Nelson, on the right. This is May 1911. And these are postcards because this violence was so rampant. Now, right, you don't have to wear a mask. You can just be you. You can go out and lynch Black people, and there's no accountability. There's no enforcement of the law. You are free to do what you want and do what you will with Black people. If in your mind, Black people are presenting an issue or a problem. So a Black person's safety, as it has always been in this country, and someone else has said this, I can't remember who, but resides in the perspectives and perceptions, interpretations of white people, of what they deem you doing, being, how they deem you presenting in any moment. Your safety relies on that. If they see you as causing an issue at work because of your behavior, your attitude, the way that you're looking, the look that you have on your face, which might be your normal look, they will get rid of you. If they see you as being too loud, they will try to have you ejected from their environment. So this is an extreme depiction, but I want you to really pay attention to the fact that these deeds, these actions taken by white people during this period and beyond were facilitated by the Supreme Court ruling against acts that Congress passed to protect us. So this is Jesse Washington in Waco, Texas, 1916. And Vernon Jarrett, who's the father-in-law of Valerie Jarrett, who worked for President Obama, he's featured in that video towards the end. And he says, white folks will go get dressed up. This was a ritual. These were rituals. This is the barbecue we had last night. My picture is to the left with the cross over it. Your son, Joe. This is John and Charles Ruggles in 1892 in Redding, California. This is Clyde Johnson in 1935 in Sacramento, Eureka area. And look at the people down below. It's like being at a concert or watching a movie. They are entirely disconnected from the humanity of Black people and cut off fingers, cut off toes, cut off private parts to take home as momentums, or what do you call it, to memorialize the occasion, mementos. 3,000 will burn Negro. 1 woman, 3 men are lynched. I'm going to come back to the other one. 1 woman, 3 men are lynched. Hamilton, Georgia. 3,000 will burn Negro. I'm sorry, 3,000. Yeah, 3,000 will burn Negro. Not have burned Negro or not did burn the Negro. Will. So this is an invitation, if you will. John Hartfield will be lynched by Ellisville mob at 5 o'clock this afternoon. Governor Bilbo, so the governor of Mississippi, is powerless to prevent it. Thousands of people are flocking into Ellisville to attend the event. Sheriff and authorities are powerless to prevent it. Negro seized by Florida mob. Negro killed, Lowndes man free on bond. So under enforcement of the law, or no enforcement of the law, when it comes to violent terrorism enacted upon Black people. And you can be lynched for acting too suspicious, or white people deeming you too popular or too successful, gambling, if you're causing a quarrel, if dating white women, that was a huge reason. Inflammatory language, testifying against whites, giving evidence against whites, insulting white men, vagrancy, whatever they deemed as vagrancy. Because remember, during this period, if you didn't have a job that a white person perceived as employment, you could be arrested. Disorderly conduct, or if you chose to vote. All these were very popular rationales, common rationales as to why people would be lynched. Negro lynched to avenge assault on white woman. Texas lynch, wrong Negro. So you have to disconnect from the humanity of people in order to be able to pull this off. And you bring your children out and they learn this mentality. It's a country that's founded on violence through force in wars, where land is taken from one group and then you've got force and violence happening to enculturate and or bring people here against their will and create conditions of rape, enact laws where you are able to murder them without consequence. It's a culture of violence. So the violence that Black people exhibit towards each other is based on a white psychology and a white mentality. It's what we have learned from white people. It's also based on what white people have made permissible in this culture. It is permissive to mistreat Black people. It is permissible to dehumanize Black people in any and every context. So this is a postcard from Duluth, Minnesota. So 2 of the Black victims are still hanging while the 3rd is on the ground. You can see him down here. Postcards of lynching were popular souvenirs in the US. So Isaac McGee, Elias Clayton, and Elmer Johnson. You've got Abram Smith and Thomas Shipp. And again, just look at the people who are turning around casually, taking pictures. So in this book, Without Sanctuary, one of the excerpts, it says, although some whites found lynchings unacceptable and barbaric, few of the perpetrators were ever brought to trial. Townspeople closed ranks, protect their own kind, thereby becoming partners in crimes committed. Eyewitnesses refused to testify, and grand juries refused to bring indictments against easily identifiable mob participants. Even if they had, juries would have refused to convict whatever the evidence. This is Lynch Shaw, a businessman in 1936. Leach Daniels. This is where they lynched a Negro the other day. They don't know who done it. I guess they don't care much. I don't. Do you? A total disconnection from the humanity of Black people. A culture that is preoccupied with dehumanizing the existence of Black people or people that they deem and or label or interpret as Black in order to provide themselves and their collective community a sense of value. Cheryl Harris says very bluntly in her paper, which I quote in my book as well, Whiteness as Property, that whiteness is based on the inherent need to subjugate. In the vast majority of reported lynchings, the courts, coroners, juries, or other official bodies chosen to investigate the murders concluded routinely that Black victims had met their deaths at the hands of unknown parties, at the hands of persons unknown, or by persons unknown to the jury. Ida B. Wells says our country's national crime is lynching. It is not the creature of an hour, the sudden outburst of uncontrolled fury, or the unspeakable brutality of an insane mob. It represents cool, calculating deliberation of intelligent people who openly avow that there is an unwritten law that justifies them in putting human beings to death without complaint by jury, without complaint under oath, without trial by jury, without opportunity to make defense, and without right of appeal. Lynching, and this is Walter Francis White, who was the NAACP head during this period at the early 20th century. He says, lynching is much more an expression of Southern fear of Negro progress than of Negro crime. So not only did distinguished public officials at all levels of government hesitate to condemn lynching, some also chose to participate in lynch mobs. So you've got William Van Amberg Sullivan, who's a senator from Mississippi. He says, I led the mob which lynched Nels Patton, and I am proud of it. I directed every movement of the mob, and I did everything I could to see that he was lynched. 1908. Cole Blease, governor of South Carolina, I would have gladly resigned as governor rather than use my power of office to deter whites from punishing that nigger brute, Willis Jackson. If necessary, I would have come to Hone Path and led the mob. Governor Theodore Bilbo, 1948, I call on every red-blooded white man to use any means to keep the niggers away from the polls, right? And that's exactly what happens. Strom Thurmond, who was a senator until 2002, who was the governor of South Carolina, he ran on the presidential ticket of the Dixiecrats in 1948 against Truman, Harry Truman. He says, I want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that there's not enough troops in the army to force the Southern people to break down segregation and admit the nigger race into our theaters, into our swimming pools, into our homes, and into our churches. This is when they were talking about integrating the army. The photographs stretch our credulity, even numb our minds and senses to the full extent of the horror, but they must be examined if we are to understand how normal men and women could live with, participate in, and defend such atrocities, even interpret them so they would not see themselves or be perceived as less than civilized. And I want people to think about where we are now with elected officials refusing to vote on the George Floyd Policing Act. with elected officials who are choosing to not pass gun control legislation. The men and women who tortured, dismembered, and murdered in this fashion understood perfectly well what they were doing and thought of themselves as perfectly normal human beings. Few had any ethical qualms about their actions. This was not the outburst of crazed men or uncontrolled barbarians, but the triumph of a belief system that defined one people as less human than another. For the men and women who comprised these mobs, as for those who remained silent or indifferent or who provided the scientific scholarly explanations, this was the highest idealism in the service of their race, in preservation of their heritage. One has only to view the self-satisfied expressions on their face as they pose beneath Black people hanging from a rope or next to the charred remains of a Negro who had been burned to death. What is most disturbing about these scenes is the discovery that the perpetrators of these crimes were ordinary people, not so different from ourselves: merchants, farmers, laborers, machine operators, teachers, lawyers, doctors, policemen, students. They were family men and women, good, decent, church-going folk who came to believe that keeping Black people in their place was nothing less than pest control, a way of combating an epidemic or virus that, if not checked, would become or would be detrimental to the health and security of the community. So this is Reuben Stacy. And this excerpt says, "Do not look at the Negro. His earthly problems are ended. Instead, look at the 7 white children who gaze at this gruesome spectacle. Is it horror or gloating on the face of the neatly dressed 7-year-old girl on the right? Is the tiny 4-year-old on the left old enough, one wonders, to comprehend the barbarism her elders have perpetrated? Reuben Stacy, the Negro, who was lynched at Fort Lauderdale, Florida on July 19, 1935, for threatening and frightening a white woman, suffered physical torture for a few short hours. But what psychological havoc is being wrought in the minds of the white children? Into what kinds of citizens will they become? Whose grandparents are these right now, John? These people would be 87 years old? Who's grand?
Whole lot of them.
Right?
All across this country.
Right? So we've got rampant terror requesting 4 12-year-old girls be strip searched at the school because they were laughing loudly in the cafeteria. So from the entrance of our footing onto this country, the forcible entrance into this country, the forcible reinforced terroristic conditions that were thrust upon us, right? Through periods of reinforced marginalization, reinforced vile treatment, reinforced dehumanization and terrorism, right? Into the present. Nothing has changed. And so you have under enforcement of the law, decisions made by judges. This is 2016, where he gives probation to this college student at Stanford as a result of sexual assault that he committed onto another student, I believe it was a young Asian woman. He gave him probation. You got this white guy, Christopher Belcher, who raped 4 young teenage girls. He was facing 8 years of probation 8 years in prison. Instead, the judge gave him 8 years probation. What led James Holmes into the Aurora Theater shooting? New book suggests answers aren't likely. Adam Lanza, Sandy Hook. Las Vegas shooting, 59 killed and more than 500 hurt near Mandalay Bay. Texas church shooting, the Gilroy Garlic Festival. All of these happened within the last 10 years. Dylan Roof was very clear about why he murdered these Black people, went into a church and opened gunfire on them during Bible study. Kyle Rittenhouse acquitted of all charges in the trial over killing 2 in Kenosha, left his home in another city in another state, traveled across state lines, I believe. He traveled across state lines. Certain police entities or law enforcement entities contributed to his GoFundMe account, raising, I believe, somewhere in the range of either 1 million or over 2 million. It was some high astronomical amount, right? Acquitted, under enforcement, no accountability whatsoever.
But go back to what you said, Dante. The people who write the laws don't enforce the law.
Grand jury indicts suspect in Buffalo shooting. He was indicted on 1 count of murder after murdering 10 people and being very clear about why he was murdering them, because they were Black. So Dr. Amos Wilson says there's no one more like the oppressor than the Black on Black criminal. The Black on Black criminal is a white man in blackface. He exhibits the same attitude towards his people as the white racist does. He doesn't love them, he hates them. He rejects them, he feels apart from them. So this is everyone from Ben Carson to Clarence Thomas to people who might be committing murders in the neighborhoods, in Black communities, onto Black people. He sees them merely as tools of exploitation. And when you look at the psychology of the Black on Black violent criminal, you will see that psychology exactly parallels to white racists, because he has internalized the white racist lies, and now he has become an instrument for their activity against his own people. And in acting the way he does, he thinks he's acting like a white man. So if the white man is free to kick the N-word's butt, he figures his freedom is the same thing. If he sees the white man's freedom as his capacity is to treat Black people any way he feels and to rise above the law, then he, in imitating the white man, is going to do the same thing the white man does. That's why we've got to get over the equality game, because if a person lives upon our oppression, if their lifestyle is based on our oppression and exploitation, then to be just like them is to join in with them in oppressing our own people. And it becomes self-oppression as well. Therefore, what it means to be free and what it means to be equal cannot be what it means to be like white folk. So going back, and I've shared this perspective a few times, Dr. Alvin Poussant, who was the dean of students at the Harvard, School of Psychiatry. He says, I think we have to establish that white racism is a mental illness. Many white social scientists would like to define racism as something that is normal. as a cultural variant. As long as we define it, as long as we approach it that way, we really don't deal with the pathology of racism itself. It's like saying that cancer, because a lot of people have it in this society, is somehow normal. And so in the psychopathic personality, the psychopathic racial personality, which was a paper that was included in a collective of writings by the late psychologist, Dr. Bobby Wright. And I believe that this now expands to most Americans, most, if not all, in the ways in which Black people are dealt with and treated in this culture. Because again, the anti-Black orientation is a cultural aspect of American identity. It's something that we all suffer from, that I write about in my book. So Dr. Bobby Wright says, in their relationship with the Black race, whites are psychopaths, and their behavior represents an underlying biologically transmitted proclivity with roots deep in their evolutionary history. The psychopath is an individual who is constantly in conflict with other persons or groups. He is unable to experience guilt, is completely selfish and callous, and has a total disregard for the rights of others. One of the best methods that can be used to measure the psychopathic traits of the white race and of all Americans is observing and analyzing their universal overt behaviors and attitudes towards Blacks. Psychopaths simply ignore the concept of right and wrong. By ignoring this trait in the white race, the lack of ethical and moral development, Blacks have made and are still making a tragic mistake in basing the worldwide Black liberation movement on moral suasion. It is pathological for Blacks to keep attempting to use moral suasion on a people who have no morality, where race is the variable. So this is true. I believe this is expanded out into American identity, because based on white domination and control, we have become a culture of people in American society who lack empathy, who do not value human life. It is very transactional. Everything that we value is transaction-based. It is transactional-oriented. Malcolm X says, when you are in your own nation, in your own land, you're in a position to get justice. But when you are in another man's country, in another man's land, under another man's flag, under another man's government, and under another man's court system, you have to look to that other man for justice, and you'll never get it. So, John, I want to end just by sharing two quick clips, if I may. Is that okay?
Man, you do whatever you want to do, brother. Go on and put them up there. Okay. So the first one is from Toni Morrison, a talk that she gave, an interview that she gave in the mid-1990s, the early 1990s, that really reinforces the points that I just made, but she says it in another way. And I appreciated her framing of racism being something that's like a profound neurosis that has not been examined for what it really is, right? That it is indeed a sickness. So I'm going to share this quick clip. She's being interviewed by Charlie Rose about her book at the time.
Arthur Ashe was here, the late Arthur Ashe.
Yes.
And he said to me, as he said in one other place, he said, in a much quoted comment, he said, living with AIDS is easier than living with racism. It's a harder struggle against racism for me than it is against AIDS. What it meant to me is that there's no way for the rest of us to understand that daily encounter. Which brings me to my question to you. Do you still have that encounter? Do you, Toni Morrison, Pulitzer Prize winner, successful, honored in the halls of academia, etc., still have that encounter?
Yes, I do, Charlie, but let me tell you, that's the wrong question.
Okay, what's the right question?
How do you feel? Not you, Charlie Rose, but don't you understand that the people who do this thing, who practice racism, are bereft? There is something distorted about the psyche. It's a huge waste, and it's a corruption and a distortion. It's like it's a profound neurosis that nobody examines for what it is. It feels crazy. It is crazy. And it leaves it has just as much of a deleterious effect on white people and possibly equal as it does black people. I always knew that I had the moral high ground all my life. I always thought those people who said I couldn't come in the drugstore and I had to sit in these funny places, I couldn't go in the park.
Superior to them
I
from
did.
day one.
And I thought they knew that I knew that they were inferior to me morally. I always thought that. And my parents always thought that.
You said your father was racist because he always felt like he was
always
superior.
Thought, that's right. He always felt superior. And that was a form, of defensive racism. But if the racist white person, I don't mean the person who is examining his consciousness and so on, doesn't understand that he or she is also a race, it's also constructed, it's also made, and it also has some kind of serviceability. But when you take it away, I take your race away. And there you are, all strung out, and all you got is your little self. And what is that? What are you without racism? Are you any good? Are you still strong? You still smart? You still like yourself? I mean, these are the questions. It's part of it is, yes, the victim, how terrible it has been for black people.
Like that.
I'm not a victim. I refuse to be one.
And the victim is the other person who is morally inferior. And
that's a serious question. Of course.
Racism
if you have to hold
for his or her own self-esteem and definition.
If you can only be tall because somebody's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And my feeling is white people have a very, very serious problem. And they should start thinking about what they can do about it. Take me out of it.
Then give white people some free advice.
They're all in my books.
And the advice is to come to grips.
Of course.
With your own fears.
Absolutely.
Your own
Look at
fears.
It. Absolutely. Your own fears, your own history, and what you need. What do you need this for?
Man. Hey, Dante.
Yeah.
That's what we dealing with right now. These white folks shooting up everything, talking about they gonna be replaced. They a minority. The fear.
And yet,
the unknown.
And yet, in much of the conversation about some of the things that go on in the Black community, we pathologize and reinforce criticisms about Black people, and particularly Black men, about the way that violence is happening in our community. You have a whole string of white psychopaths and sociopaths going out on rampages, and we don't consistently focus on that. Those were just 10 examples that have happened over the last 10 years, and there have been many more, hundreds more of white men, white males going into institutions and organizations in larger society, and thousands of more of white people who are committing murders, who are stabbing people with knives, shooting people with guns in their own communities that we will never hear about. But instead, you hear about Chicago, Oakland, New York. When it comes to Black people who are, they're the criminals, they are the ones that are perpetrating the violence. We got our violence senses from white people. They gave us guns. They concentrated us in neighborhoods. So we're only emulating the behaviors and the attitudes and mentality of our oppressors. And so anytime that we think that we see a problem with Black people, it's a result of the ways that we have been socialized in this culture. It is of no doing of our own. So I want you to, and I want everyone who is
Dante, wait a second. But Dante, when you say that, you're saying that majority of these Black folk that they doing these stories on has assimilated with white ideology. Because that's
absolutely.
Oh man, we in trouble, Dante.
Absolutely. And it is of no fault of their own. It has been through forced conformity, forced assimilation, through the control of all of these institutions. We're not talking about slavery. We're talking about a lack of, we are talking about being excluded and being oppressed in terms of where you live, the type of food you eat that affects your physical being, your mental capacity to compute. If I don't eat right or have certain foods in my body, I'm not gonna be as sharp and clear. And when that food is out of reach for me, it's too expensive for me to get, to afford, it's not as fresh in my neighborhood, that makes a huge difference. If John and Dante and Shaman and 10 other Black men go to a job, but the people in that organization say, we can't hire all these Black men, we're gonna hire 2 out of the 15, then how will we all ever be successful as a collective group when our opportunities are regulated, being regulated in ways that we don't know? White people being given opportunity because they're white. No other characteristic. There's an article that I reference in my book where the white teacher says, I was a teacher for 17 years and didn't know how to read or write. That type of insufficiency, John, that type of deficiency, and yet I'm still able to succeed because the teachers pass me along to make sure that I don't fail, even though not only do I not have the qualifications, I'm illiterate. I haven't even met the standards of the game in order to participate. But because I have white capital, people pass me along. I become an educator for 17 years. I'm 17 years into my career and can't read or write. That type of opportunity is not available for Black people. You've got one of my bosses who runs one of the largest agencies, one of my former bosses. He runs one of the largest agencies in San Francisco, city and county of San Francisco. I'll say his name because he was actually pretty open about it. Jeff Tumlin. It's no secret that Mayor Breed hired him and he wasn't qualified to run that agency. He has never run an agency that size. And guess what? They passed over on a Black woman, Deborah Johnson, who had worked at the agency before. She ran transportation down in Long Beach. She had more than 20 years of experience and probably more than 10 years of experience running an agency of that comparable to the size of that agency. And they passed over her and then hired a white man who then went to the Chronicle. You can look it up. Jeff Tumlin goes on record in the Chronicle and says, I know I don't have the experience, but they hired me anyway. And if they want to fire me, that's okay because I've negotiated a nice severance worth 1 year of my salary or something like that. I mean, it's crazy. The things that go uninvestigated and uninterrogated in the ways that we have been compelled and forced in many cases to think about the reality that we are living in. So I want to share a quick video that I'm going to end with. And it actually, as you're looking at it for the people who are tuning in and also for you, John, I want you to see it through new eyes based on everything that I discussed here tonight. Can you attempt to do that?
I'm going to look at some new eyes. And Dante, I still got a question at the end of the show.
Okay.
Because of the white assimilation.
Okay.
Is Black folks afraid of white folks, Dante? I got to ask that question.
That's complicated, but we will talk about it. So this song is called Black Rage. It was recorded by Lauryn Hill. Someone took and put visuals to it. And so I share this video pretty often when I'm teaching courses because there's a lot that's contained here. And I'm inviting you to see it through new eyes based on everything that I shared here with you tonight. So it's going to come on in a few seconds.
Did you share the audio with it, Dante?
Yeah, I did. It's about to come on.
Black rage is founded on 2/3 a person, rapings and beatings and suffering that worsens. Black human packages tied up in come from all these kinds of things. Black race founded on blatant denial, squeeze economics, subsistence survival, deafening silence and social control. Black race is founded on bones in the soul. When the dogs bite, when the bees sing, when I'm feeling sad, I simply remember all these kinds of things, and then I don't feel so bad.
You took my son away from me. You know how hard it was for me to get him to damn school and graduate.
Black race founded, set us self-hatred, lies and abuse, while we waited and waited. Spiritual treason, this grid and outrageous. Black rage is founded on these kinds of things. Black rage is founded on training and training, threatening your freedom, stop your complaining, poisoning your water while they say it's raining. Only mad for complaining, complaining. Old time bureaucracy, tracking the youth. Black rage is founded on blocking the truth. Murder and crime, compromise and distortion. Sacrifice, sacrifice, who makes this fortune? We falsely call progress such human contortion. Black rage is founded on these kinds of things. When the dogs bite, when the beatings, when I'm feeling sad, I simply remember all these kinds of things, and then I don't feel so bad. Freedom surprises, mental illusion, forcing you back into corpus confusion, like human trafficking or blood transfusion. That rage is founded on these kinds of things. Victims of violence, both body and body, life out of context, living ungodly. Politics, politics, repulsively called well. Black rage is founded on denial of self.
And why is that dog pretty?
Because he's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which dog is the ugly dog? Why is that dog ugly?
Because he's black.
Sad. I simply remember all these kinds of things, and then I don't feel so bad. So bad.
I think we've got to see that a riot is the language of the unheard.
Dante, I gotta ask that question that I asked you earlier, but I gotta say, the things you talked about, every time you come on here, you light that fire. Community folks are watching. Historically, we've seen the past. We hear in the future. We have inflation. We have high gas prices. We have high interest rate. We have low Black unemployment. We are headed to some dangerous times. Black folks have been silent.
Do you understand why we have high interest rates too?
Yeah.
Because during the interest rate drop, white people were able to refinance business loans. They were able to refinance equipment loans. They were able to go out and get low-cost home loans as well. And so now that most of white America has been able to pursue financing at low cost, now these things are going up. And you also have the price of homes that are going up. And so whereas things were off limits due to discrimination and illegality based on laws that explicitly discriminated against Black people in the past, it's now based on unaffordability. So unaffordability has become the new discrimination towards communities of color, and particularly Black people who have the lowest income, who have the lowest collective net income, who actually have, at this point, I believe, a negative net worth collectively, right? And this is just for me working in banking for almost 20 years. So I understand the way money works. I had investment licenses. I also did, I was a loan agent, so I did underwriting on loans. I sold loans, understood loan conditioning and stipulations, evaluating debt to income ratio, loan to value, so it's understanding understanding the stock market and when to put money in the stock market, when to take it out, right? And because we are not taught these things in high school, these are basic things that are not hard to understand, but we are not given the landscape or the recipe about how to survive in white America from a capitalistic standpoint, because white people teach that at home. So there's no need to teach it in the school to these young Black and brown inner city ghetto children that we actually want to exterminate. All of what we're doing, all of what white America is doing against Black and brown people is to lead to our genocide. And I want to shine a light on that. So maybe I'll come back in another segment, because I talk about the unfolding of the American eugenics program and how Hitler looked to what America did in order to execute what he did against the Jewish people over in Germany. And as a matter of fact, the president of the American Eugenics Society, Leon Whitney, praised Hitler. He praised the sterilization program that he was planning on sterilizing over 400,000 Germans with, that he referred to as weaklings. This has been a program, a genocidal program.
And I think it's all happening. And I'm going to tell Sakati, I see Sakati out there. Stay out of my hands, Sakati, because I was thinking that, and I know it's going around, Dante, and I'm just saying, because we are people of energy. We are spiritual, connected beings. The temperament of Black America, brown America, the pot is boiling, Dante.
It depends on if you are in touch.
The pot is boiling, Dante. It's going to erupt, Dante. It's going to erupt.
It's been erupting. It's been erupting. But Black people, again, and this is not a criticism, this is an observation of me. This is an observation of my family. This is an observation of my friend circle and of larger community. Black people, because we have low expectations, we will accept anything as progress. And again, progress is the objective and the pursuit of the oppressed. It is not the pursuit of the oppressor. And so we will accept that, we got the right to vote in 1965, even though most of who we were voting for were white people who did not have our best interest in mind. And you see programs, the same type of decisions that are being made after civil rights legislation are enacted is to reduce and take away rights and access for Black communities. The Juvenile Delinquency Act, the Bakke versus the University of Davis Act, right? The Anti-Drug Abuse Act in '86 that's passed to extend or to enact mandatory sentencing for drug crimes, people who sold drugs, which is later extended in 1988 to users of drugs, people who now in the opioid crisis we want to help through hospitals. We took Black mothers and fathers out of the Black neighborhood because we criminalized their use of drugs when they needed help. But because we don't value Black humanity, because Black humanity is not valued, we can do anything with these people to meet our purpose. And it is a cycle and a system and culture of genocide, of Black genocide. And so that is why my book is entitled The 400-Year Holocaust, White Americas, because this happened under white colonialism. This happened under the auspices of the United States, the white United States of America. It's a white American legal, psychopathic, and sociopathic Black genocide. So if you want more information, if you would like to have become more adept to what I teach, I do teach a 2-day course offered through UCSF, which is titled Understanding the Roots of Racism and Bias, Anti-Blackness, and its links to whiteness, white racism, privilege, and power. I also teach another course and am going to be offering a fellowship, which is again, a 12 to 14 week course that is entitled Unlearning